Have you ever loved someone so deeply that even after they're gone, you'd do anything to keep their memory alive? Have you ever wondered if the person you thought you knew better than anyone in the world was actually a complete stranger? Well, let me tell you what happened to me. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the secrets people keep even from those closest to them. My name is Sarah, and for 7 years, I honored my late husband's memory in a way I thought was beautiful, meaningful, and pure. Every single month, without fail, I would take $500 from my account and donate it to the charity he loved most, the organization he talked about constantly during our marriage, the cause he said meant everything to him. I thought I was doing something noble, something that would make him proud, something that kept him alive in some small way. But then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that started like any other, I discovered something that shattered everything I believed about the man I married, the life we built together, and the 7 years I spent mourning someone who might not have deserved a single tear I shed. The truth didn't come looking for me. I stumbled upon it accidentally, and once I knew, there was no going back, no unseeing what I'd seen, no unknowing what I'd learned. This is the story of how a woman's devotion turned into betrayal, how love became a lie, and how the dead can hurt you more than the living ever could. I met Robert on a September evening 12 years ago at a gallery opening in downtown Manhattan. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. My friend canceled at the last minute, but something told me to go anyway, to put on that blue dress I'd been saving for a special occasion, to walk into that crowded room full of strangers and expensive wine. He was standing in front of a painting of a stormy ocean, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly to the left the way people do when they're genuinely contemplating art rather than just pretending to understand it. I remember thinking he looked out of place among the pretentious crowd, dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans while everyone else wore their most impressive designer labels. There was something honest about him, something real, something that drew me across that room before I even realized my feet were moving. When I stood beside him and made some nervous comment about the painting, he turned to me with these warm brown eyes that seemed to see right through all my carefully constructed walls, and he smiled. And in that moment, I felt something I'd never felt before, a sense of coming home to a place I'd never been. We talked for 3 hours that night, standing in front of that same painting while the gallery emptied around us, and the staff started giving us pointed looks. He told me he was an accountant, which seemed almost comically boring given the intensity of our conversation about art and philosophy and the meaning of existence. But Robert had this way of making even spreadsheets sound fascinating when he talked about them, this ability to find beauty and purpose in things other people found mundane. He said he loved his work because it brought order to chaos, because numbers didn't lie, because there was a pure honesty in balanced books that you couldn't find anywhere else in life. I loved that about him, his appreciation for truth and transparency, his hatred of deception in any form. He told me that night that he'd grown up in a family where everyone lied about everything, where his father had affairs his mother pretended not to know about, where his siblings backstabbed each other for inheritance money, where trust was a foreign concept that no one practiced. He said he'd promised himself he'd never be like them, that he'd build a life based on honesty, that the person he eventually married would never have to question his loyalty or wonder what he was hiding. Those words meant everything to me because I'd come from a similar background, a childhood filled with secrets and betrayals that left me unable to trust anyone fully. When Robert looked at me that night and said honesty was the foundation of any real relationship, I felt like I'd finally found someone who understood, someone who valued the same things I did, someone I could actually trust with my whole heart. Our courtship was the kind you read about in romance novels but rarely experience in real life. Robert pursued me with an intensity that was flattering but never overwhelming, planning thoughtful dates that showed he actually listened when I talked about my interests. He remembered that I mentioned loving botanical gardens, so our second date was a sunrise walk through the Brooklyn Botanic Garden when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. He noticed I'd casually mentioned enjoying old mystery novels, so he surprised me with a first edition of my favorite Agatha Christie book for our 1-month anniversary. Every gesture felt personal, considered, genuine. He introduced me to his best friend Marcus after only 3 weeks of dating, which I took as a sign that he was serious about me, that he wasn't keeping me separate from the rest of his life the way men do when they're not fully committed. Marcus was wonderful, funny and warm, and clearly devoted to Robert. And he told me that night over drinks that he'd never seen his friend this happy, that Robert talked about me constantly, that he was pretty sure I was the one. Those words made my heart soar because I was already falling, already imagining a future with this man who seemed too good to be true. We moved in together after 6 months, which everyone said was too fast. But when you know, right? That's what I told my worried mother, my skeptical sister, my concerned best friend who thought I was rushing into things. Robert made me feel safe in a way no one else ever had. He was stable, reliable, present. He came home every night at 6:30. He never gave me reason to doubt where he was or who he was with. He introduced me to his colleagues and invited me to every work event. His phone was always face up on the counter. His laptop never had a password I didn't know. His credit card statements came to our shared address, and I could look at them anytime I wanted. This was the transparency he'd promised me that first night, the honesty that was supposed to be our foundation. And I trusted him completely, more than I'd ever trusted anyone, with a faith that felt unshakable because he'd never given me a single reason to question it. The proposal came on the anniversary of the night we met, back at that same gallery in front of that same painting of the stormy ocean. Robert had arranged with the gallery owner to have the place to ourselves for an hour before opening, and when I walked in and saw candles lining the floor leading to our painting, I started crying before he even got down on one knee. He told me I was his anchor in the storm, his safe harbor, his home. He promised me a lifetime of honesty, loyalty, and love. He slipped a simple platinum band with a single diamond onto my finger, and when I said yes, I meant it with every fiber of my being. Our wedding was small and intimate, just close friends and family at a venue overlooking the Hudson River on a perfect May afternoon. I wore my grandmother's veil. Robert wore a navy suit that made his eyes look even warmer than usual, and we wrote our own vows that had everyone in tears. He promised to always tell me the truth, even when it was difficult, even when it might hurt, because he said our relationship deserved nothing less than complete honesty. I promised to trust him always, to believe in him, to stand by his side through whatever challenges life brought us. And I kept that promise through 5 beautiful years of marriage, through career changes and family dramas and health scares and all the ordinary struggles that test a relationship. Robert was my partner in every sense of the word, my best friend, my confidant, my safe place in a chaotic world. We talked about everything, shared everything, or at least I thought we did. We had dreams of starting a family, of buying a house with a big backyard, of growing old together and becoming that cute elderly couple who still holds hands after 50 years. He supported my decision to go back to school for my master's degree, staying up late to help me study even though he had early morning meetings. I supported his volunteer work with the youth mentorship program he was so passionate about, attending fundraisers and helping him prepare for the career workshops he led on weekends. Our life together felt full, rich, meaningful. We weren't perfect. We had our arguments like any couple, but we always talked through them, always went to bed having resolved our conflicts, always chose our relationship over our egos. Looking back now, I wonder if I was seeing what I wanted to see, believing what I needed to believe, trusting blindly because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Everything changed on a Wednesday in October, 5 years into our marriage, when Robert died in what the police called a tragic accident. He was driving home from a late meeting, taking the highway route he'd driven 1,000 times before, when his car veered off the road and hit a concrete barrier at high speed. The officers who came to my door that night said he probably fell asleep at the wheel, that there were no skid marks suggesting he tried to brake, that it would have been instant, that he didn't suffer. Those words were supposed to comfort me, but how could anything comfort me when the person I loved most in the world was suddenly gone? When I'd kissed him goodbye that morning, never knowing it was the last time, when our future together had been erased in a single moment. The grief hit me like a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs, making it impossible to eat or sleep or function in any normal way. I moved through the funeral arrangements in a fog, accepting condolences from people whose faces I couldn't really see, listening to stories about Robert from colleagues and friends that felt like they were talking about a stranger. Marcus gave the eulogy and broke down halfway through, unable to continue, and I felt guilty that I couldn't cry, that the shock had frozen something inside me so completely that tears wouldn't come. They came later, weeks later, in the middle of the night when I'd reach across the bed and find it empty, when I'd start to call him to tell him something funny and remember he'd never answer again, when I'd catch a glimpse of his coffee mug in the cabinet and be overwhelmed by the reality that he'd never drink from it again. The first year was survival, nothing more. I went through the motions of living because people expected me to, because my mother kept showing up at my apartment to make sure I was eating, because my boss was patient but couldn't hold my position open forever. I went back to work after 3 months, moving through my days like a robot, performing tasks without really being present. At night, I'd sit in our apartment surrounded by Robert's things, his book still on the shelf, his jacket still hanging by the door, his cologne still on the bathroom counter because I couldn't bring myself to throw anything away. People kept telling me I needed to move on, to start the healing process, to consider dating again eventually, but the thought made me sick. How could I even think about another man when Robert had been everything to me, when our love had been so perfect, so pure, so real? The idea for the monthly donation came to me about 6 months after his death, during one of those endless sleepless nights when memories of Robert played on repeat in my mind. I was thinking about the youth mentorship program he'd been so dedicated to, remembering how his eyes would light up when he talked about the kids he worked with, how proud he'd been when one of his mentees got accepted to college. The organization was called Future Foundations, and Robert had volunteered there for 3 years before we even met. He'd told me countless stories about troubled teenagers who turned their lives around because someone finally believed in them, about kids from rough backgrounds who just needed guidance and support to realize their potential. He said the work made him feel like he was making a real difference in the world, that helping these young people was his way of creating something meaningful beyond his regular job. On our first anniversary, instead of expensive gifts, we'd made donations to each other's favorite charities, and I'd given $500 to Future Foundations in his name because I knew how much it would mean to him. The joy on his face when I told him was worth more than any material gift could have been. So 6 months after losing him, sitting alone in our apartment at 3 in the morning, I decided I would honor his memory by continuing that tradition. Every month on the anniversary of his death, I would donate $500 to Future Foundations. It wasn't a small amount for me, especially on my single income, but it felt important, necessary even. This was my way of keeping Robert's legacy alive, of ensuring that his passion for helping others didn't die with him, of maintaining a connection to the man I'd loved so completely. The first donation felt sacred somehow, like I was doing something Robert would have wanted, something that would make him proud wherever he was. I created an online account with Future Foundations, set up the recurring monthly donation, and each time I got the confirmation email, I felt a small sense of peace, like I was still taking care of him in some way, still honoring the values he'd held so dear. For 7 years, I never missed a single month. Even when money was tight and I had to skip buying new clothes or eating out with friends, that $500 went to Future Foundations without fail. It became my ritual, my way of marking time since losing Robert, my method of staying connected to the man I still loved desperately despite the years that had passed. On the 10th of every month, I'd sit at my laptop, log into the donation portal, submit the payment, and then I'd talk to Robert, out loud in my empty apartment, telling him about my month, about the kids his donation was helping, about how much I still missed him. My therapist said this ritual was healthy, that it was giving me a sense of purpose and helping me process my grief. My mother worried it was preventing me from moving on, from opening my heart to the possibility of new love, but I didn't care. This felt right to me, felt like the least I could do for a man who'd been so good to me, who'd loved me so purely, who'd promised me forever and had that promise stolen from him too soon. I'd visit his grave on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the grass to tell him about the donations, about the lives being changed because of his legacy. I'd imagine him smiling that warm smile, those brown eyes crinkling at the corners, telling me he was proud of me, grateful for what I was doing. The grief evolved over those 7 years, becoming less sharp but more permanent. A constant ache I learned to live with the way you learn to live with chronic pain. I went on a few dates because well-meaning friends kept setting me up, but my heart was never in it, and it felt disloyal somehow to even consider replacing Robert. He'd been my soulmate, my once-in-a-lifetime love, and I genuinely believed I'd never feel that way about anyone again. The monthly donations became the center of my emotional life, the thing that gave me purpose, the tangible way I could continue loving Robert, even though he was gone. I never questioned it, never thought to investigate further, never had any reason to doubt that my money was going exactly where I thought it was going, helping exactly who I thought it was helping. Then came that Tuesday in April, 7 years and 6 months after Robert's death, when my entire world turned upside down in the span of about 30 seconds. I was cleaning out my closet, finally forcing myself to go through some of Robert's old things that I'd boxed up but never actually dealt with. My therapist had been gently suggesting for months that this might be a healthy next step, that holding on to everything wasn't helping me move forward, that I could keep a few meaningful items and donate the rest without betraying his memory. So I'd set aside a weekend to tackle the boxes stored in the back of my closet, the ones I'd packed right after his death and hadn't touched since. Most of it was clothes and books, items that were easy to sort into donate and keep piles. But then I found a box I didn't remember packing, a cardboard filing box with his name written on the side in his own handwriting. Inside were papers, old tax returns, and insurance documents, and the kind of mundane financial records everyone accumulates, but no one ever looks at. I was about to close it back up, not in the mood to deal with 7-year-old paperwork, when I noticed an envelope tucked into the side of the box, partially hidden behind a folder of old pay stubs. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with no writing on the outside. Something made me open it. Maybe curiosity, maybe fate, maybe the universe deciding it was finally time for me to know the truth. Inside were bank statements for an account I'd never seen before, an account in Robert's name at a bank we'd never used together. My hands started shaking as I looked at the dates. These statements were from the last year of Robert's life, statements he'd apparently hidden from me, kept in this envelope in a box I wasn't supposed to find. The account had significant activity, deposits and withdrawals I couldn't explain, transactions that made no sense with what I knew about our finances. But what made my blood run cold, what made the room start spinning around me, was a recurring monthly payment listed on every single statement. $500 withdrawn on the 10th of every month, paid to something called Riverside Holdings, LLC. $500, the 10th of every month. The exact same amount I'd been donating to future foundations for 7 years, on the exact same day, thinking I was honoring my husband's memory and supporting the cause he loved. Have you ever had that experience where something clicks in your mind, where puzzle pieces you didn't even know were scattered suddenly start coming together to form a picture you really don't want to see? That's what happened to me in that moment. Sitting on my closet floor surrounded by Robert's old clothes and these bank statements that didn't make sense. My mind was racing, trying to find an innocent explanation, trying to convince myself this was nothing, just some business expense I didn't know about, some investment he'd made that he planned to tell me about eventually. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, that the foundation I'd built my entire grief on was cracking, that the man I'd been mourning might not have been who I thought he was. I grabbed my laptop and searched for Riverside Holdings, LLC, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The search results were confusing at first. Legal documents and business filings that meant nothing to me, but then I found it. A small mention in a local news article from 8 years ago about a property management company called Riverside Holdings that had been investigated for operating unlicensed rental properties. The article mentioned the company was owned by someone named Patricia Hewson and had been shut down after the investigation. Patricia Hewson. The name meant nothing to me. I'd never heard Robert mention anyone by that name, had no idea who this woman was or why my husband would have been sending her $500 every month. I searched for her name next, scrolling through social media profiles and public records, trying to find some connection to Robert, some explanation that would make this make sense. And then I found her Facebook profile, set to public, filled with photos and posts from a life I knew nothing about. She was attractive, probably around my age, with long dark hair and a bright smile that made me feel sick to look at. But what really destroyed me, what made me drop my laptop and run to the bathroom to throw up, was a photo from 7 years ago, posted just 2 months before Robert died. It was a picture of Patricia standing in front of a house with a sold sign in the yard, and the caption read, "Finally bought my forever home. Couldn't have done it without my rock. You know who you are." There were heart emojis, celebration emojis, and in the comments, a bunch of people congratulating her, asking about her mystery man, telling her she deserved happiness. Robert had died in October. This photo was from August, just 2 months before the accident. Just 2 months before he left for that late meeting and never came home. Just 2 months before I became a widow and started my 7-year journey of grief and devotion to a man who was apparently living some kind of double life I knew nothing about. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was seeing. This had to be wrong. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Patricia was a cousin I didn't know about. Maybe the payments were for some kind of legitimate business arrangement. Maybe that Facebook post was about someone else entirely. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew, deep in my gut, where truth lives before your brain is ready to accept it, I knew that something terrible had been happening right under my nose, that the man I'd trusted completely had been keeping secrets, that my perfect marriage had been built on lies I was too naive or too trusting or too in love to see. I spent the rest of that day in a state of shock, alternating between denial and rage and grief that felt even worse than what I'd experienced when Robert first died. Because when someone dies, you grieve the loss of them, but at least you have the memories, the certainty of what you had together, the comfort of knowing you were loved. But this was different. This was losing him all over again, while simultaneously losing the past we'd shared, questioning every moment, every word, every promise he'd ever made. I pulled out every box, every drawer, every file folder in our apartment, looking for more evidence, more clues, more secrets Robert had hidden from his honest, transparent wife who thought she knew everything about him. And I found them. Oh, God. I found so many things I'd missed before. Credit card statements for a card I didn't know existed, with charges at restaurants I'd never been to, at hotels in cities he'd supposedly never visited, at jewelry stores during times when he'd given me nothing, receipts tucked into jacket pockets for expensive dinners for two on nights when he'd told me he was working late, a second cell phone hidden in his gym bag, the battery long dead, but the existence of it confirming what I already knew, that my husband had been living two lives, that I'd been one piece of his world while another woman, Patricia, had been another piece, and neither of us knew about the other. Or maybe she knew. Maybe I was the fool who was kept in the dark while everyone else was in on the secret. Maybe Marcus knew. Maybe his colleagues knew. Maybe I was the only idiot who actually believed in Robert's promises of honesty and loyalty. The rage came in waves after the initial shock wore off. I wanted to scream, to break things, to find Robert's grave and dig him up just so I could kill him again myself for what he'd done to me. For the 7 years I'd wasted mourning someone who didn't deserve my tears. For the thousands of dollars I'd donated thinking I was honoring his memory, when really I should have been cursing his name. But underneath the rage was something worse. A bone-deep humiliation that made me want to hide from the world. Because how had I not known? How had I missed the signs that must have been there? What kind of fool trusts so completely that they don't see the truth right in front of them? I thought about all the times Robert had come home from his late meetings, how he'd kiss me and tell me he missed me and make love to me like I was the only woman in the world, and now I wondered if he'd been with her just hours before, if he'd showered at her place before coming home to me, if he'd whispered the same sweet lies to both of us. I thought about the future foundations, the charity he'd supposedly been so passionate about, and I wondered if that was even real, or just another lie, another layer to the performance he'd been giving for 5 years of our marriage. I logged into their website with shaking hands, half expecting to find it didn't exist, but it was there. A legitimate organization doing legitimate work with at-risk youth. So that part at least was real. His volunteer work had been genuine, but somehow that made it worse. That he could be doing good in one part of his life while perpetrating such a fundamental betrayal in another. How did those two Roberts exist in the same person? How did the man who mentored troubled teenagers and spoke so passionately about honesty and trust turn around and maintain a secret relationship that involved secret bank accounts and hidden phones and lies upon lies upon lies? I didn't sleep that night, or the next night, or the night after that. I just sat in my apartment surrounded by evidence of Robert's deception, trying to reconcile the man I thought I'd married with the reality of who he'd actually been. I knew I needed to find Patricia, to confront her, to get answers to the thousands of questions burning through my mind like acid. But I was terrified too. Terrified of what I might learn. Terrified of having my worst suspicions confirmed. Terrified of looking like a pathetic widow who couldn't accept that her dead husband had been cheating on her. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to send her a message through Facebook, my fingers hovering over the keyboard for nearly an hour before I finally typed out the words. I kept it simple, just said I was Robert's widow, that I'd found some financial records I didn't understand, that I hoped she could help me make sense of them. I hit send before I could change my mind, then immediately regretted it, panicking about what she might say, how she might react, whether I even wanted to know the truth. She responded within 2 hours, which somehow made everything more real, more immediate, more terrifying. Her message was short, just said we should talk in person, that this wasn't a conversation to have over Facebook, that she could meet me the next day at a coffee shop near her house. The fact that she didn't deny knowing Robert, didn't express confusion about why I was contacting her, told me everything I needed to know even before we met. She knew exactly who I was, had probably known about me the whole time, maybe had even seen photos of me, maybe had stalked my social media the way I was now stalking hers. The thought made me sick. The idea that this woman had been a silent presence in my life for years, that she'd known about Robert's death, might have even attended his funeral from a distance, watching me grieve while she grieved too, both of us mourning the same man who'd belonged fully to neither of us. I spent the day before our meeting veering between rage and despair, practicing what I'd say to her, how I'd confront her, whether I'd be calm and collected or whether I'd scream and cry and demand answers she might not be able to give. I looked at her Facebook photos obsessively, trying to see what Robert had seen in her, trying to understand what she'd given him that I hadn't, torturing myself with comparisons and what-ifs and the cruel mathematics of betrayal. She was beautiful, but I was beautiful too. She seemed successful, but I had a good career as well. She looked fun and spontaneous in her photos, but Robert had never complained that I was boring or predictable. So what was it? What had driven him to risk everything, to build this elaborate secret life, to lie to me every single day for God knows how long? The coffee shop Patricia chose was in a neighborhood I'd never been to, a trendy area with boutiques and organic markets and young families pushing expensive strollers. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my car, watching people come and go, trying to calm my racing heart and sweating palms. When I finally saw her walk up to the entrance, I almost couldn't get out of the car, almost drove away and let her sit there waiting. Let the questions remain unanswered. Let the truth stay buried with Robert where maybe it belonged. But I forced myself to move, to walk into that coffee shop, to approach the table where she'd sat down, to look into the eyes of the woman my husband had been sending $500 a month for reasons I still didn't fully understand. She recognized me immediately, stood up with this sad smile on her face, and said my name like she'd said it before, like she knew me, like we were old friends meeting after too long apart. The sound of my name from her lips made me want to hit her, to scream, to demand she never speak to me again. But instead, I just sat down, silent and shaking, waiting for her to explain what the hell had been going on. Patricia ordered coffee for both of us without asking what I wanted, which annoyed me more than it should have, and then she took a deep breath and said the words I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "I was Robert's girlfriend," she said simply. No preamble, no easing into it, just ripping off the Band-Aid in one brutal motion. "We were together for 3 years before he died. I didn't know about you at first. He told me he was single, that he lived alone, that he'd never found the right person to settle down with. By the time I found out he was married, I was already in love with him, and he swore he was going to leave you, that your marriage was over in everything but name, that he just needed time to figure out the logistics." She paused, took a sip of her coffee, and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. I couldn't tell which, and didn't care. "The monthly payments were for rent," she continued. "He helped me get my apartment after I lost my job, said he wanted to take care of me, that we were building a future together. When I bought my house, he'd been planning to move in with me. We'd set a date. He was going to tell you everything the week he died. And then the accident happened, and I lost him too. But I couldn't grieve publicly like you could, couldn't go to the funeral, couldn't tell anyone what he meant to me because I was the secret, the other woman, the one nobody could know about." The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence another strike that left me reeling and gasping for air. 3 years. He'd been with her for 3 years. More than half of our marriage. More than half of the time I'd thought we were building our forever together. And the things she was saying, they couldn't be true. Robert had been happy with me, had told me he loved me every day, had made plans for our future together, had talked about starting a family and buying a house and growing old together. How could he have been planning to leave me? How could he have been building a life with her while still sleeping next to me every night, still kissing me goodbye every morning, still holding my hand during movies, and surprising me with flowers and looking at me like I was his whole world? I wanted to call her a liar, to tell her she was delusional, that Robert would never have left me for her or anyone else. But the evidence was right there in the bank statements I'd brought with me, in the dates and amounts that matched perfectly with what she was saying, in the timeline that made horrible, perfect sense. "You're lying," I said anyway, my voice shaking with rage and grief and desperate hope that maybe, somehow, this wasn't real. "Robert loved me. He would never have left me. Whatever you think you had with him, you're wrong. You misunderstood. You were just some fling he was going to end." But even as I said it, I could see the truth in her eyes, could see her own pain and loss reflected back at me, could see that she'd loved him too, that she'd been devastated when he died, that she'd spent 7 years mourning the same man I had, unable to talk about it with anyone, because their relationship had been a secret. Patricia pulled out her phone and showed me photos, pictures of her and Robert together, hundreds of them, dating back 3 years, just like she'd said. Robert with his arm around her at a restaurant. Robert kissing her at a beach I'd never been to. Robert asleep in what was clearly her bed, vulnerable and peaceful and intimate in a way that made my stomach turn. There were screenshots of text messages too, sweet and loving and sexual, messages where he called her baby and sweetheart and told her he couldn't wait to start their life together for real, told her leaving me was the hardest thing he'd ever have to do, but that she was worth it, that what they had was real love, not the comfortable companionship he'd settled for in his marriage. Comfortable companionship, that's what he'd called us, what he'd reduced our 5 years together to when he was with her. I couldn't look at any more photos, couldn't read another text message, couldn't sit in that coffee shop pretending to have a civilized conversation when everything inside me was screaming. I stood up so fast my chair fell backwards, drawing looks from other customers, but I didn't care. Didn't care about anything except getting out of there, getting away from Patricia and her sad eyes, and her photos, and her truth that was destroying everything I'd believed about my life. She followed me out to the parking lot, calling my name, saying she was sorry, saying she thought I deserved to know, saying she'd been carrying this secret for 7 years, and it had been eating her alive too. Why now? I turned on her, tears streaming down my face, my voice raw with pain. Why tell me now after 7 years? Why not just let me keep believing he loved me, that I was mourning someone who deserved it? Why destroy the only comfort I had left? Patricia's eyes filled with tears too, and when she spoke, her voice was as broken as mine. Because I couldn't watch you keep donating to that charity in his name. Keep talking about what a good man he was. Keep building him into some kind of saint when he was just as flawed and selfish and human as the rest of us. I've been following you online, I know that's creepy, but I needed to feel connected to the only other person who understood what losing him felt like. And every month when you'd post about your donation to future foundations, about honoring Robert's legacy, it killed me because that money, your money, it was the same amount he gave me every month. And you were turning his payments to his mistress into some noble gesture, and I couldn't take it anymore, couldn't watch you sacrifice for a memory that wasn't even real. The truth of her words, the terrible logic of them, made something inside me shatter completely. She was right. I had been sacrificing, had been living like a widow in mourning while the man I was mourning had been planning to leave me for another woman. Every donation I'd made, every time I'd skipped buying something for myself so I could afford that $500, every moment I'd spent talking to Robert's grave about the good work his money was doing, it had all been based on a lie, a fundamental misunderstanding of who he'd been and what he'd wanted. I don't remember driving home that day, don't remember anything between leaving that parking lot and finding myself sitting on my bathroom floor hours later, still in my jacket and shoes, staring at nothing while my mind tried to process the impossible. I kept thinking about all the times Robert had volunteered at future foundations, wondering now if he'd even actually been there, if that had been another cover story for time spent with Patricia, if anything he'd told me had been true. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus, Robert's best friend, the one who'd given the eulogy at the funeral, the one who'd checked on me regularly in the months after Robert died, the one who'd told me that first night we met that Robert was serious about me, that I was the one. He answered on the second ring, probably heard the tears in my voice when I said his name, immediately asked what was wrong. "Did you know?" I asked without preamble, without explanation, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line that told me everything before he even spoke. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice heavy with guilt and shame, "I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you so many times, but it wasn't my secret to tell, and Robert kept promising he was going to end it with her, and I hoped he'd do the right thing eventually." So Marcus knew, had known the whole time, had looked me in the eye at the funeral and held me while I cried, and let me believe my husband had been faithful when he knew Robert had been living a double life. I hung up on him mid-sentence, blocked his number, added him to the list of people I'd lost that day along with my memory of Robert and my trust in my own judgment and my faith that love meant anything at all. The betrayal felt endless, spreading out in all directions, touching everything and everyone I'd thought I could count on. I wondered who else knew, if Robert's colleagues had covered for him, if our couple friends had been in on the secret, if people had pitied me at dinner parties while I sat there oblivious, if the whole world had been laughing at the stupid wife who didn't know her husband was cheating on her right under her nose. The weeks that followed were a blur of anger and investigation and grief that made the original mourning period look like nothing in comparison. I hired a private investigator even though Robert was dead, needed to know the full extent of his lies, needed to understand exactly what my marriage had been. The investigator found more than I'd bargained for. Robert hadn't just had Patricia. There had been someone before her too. A woman named Jennifer who he'd been seeing during our first year of marriage, who he'd broken up with right around the time he started getting serious with Patricia. So from day one, from the moment we exchanged vows and promised forever, Robert had been cheating, had been lying, had been the exact opposite of everything he claimed to value. The investigator found the gym membership he'd never used but paid for every month. The one with a location near Patricia's apartment where he'd claimed to work out, but obviously hadn't. Found the business trips that had never actually been for business. Confirmed with his former employer that several of the conferences Robert had attended didn't exist. That he'd taken personal vacation days and told me they were work trips. Found receipts for a Valentine's Day dinner at an expensive restaurant on a year when Robert had told me he had to work late. Had come home at midnight apologizing profusely. Had made it up to me the next day with breakfast in bed and promises that next year would be different. Except next year, he'd done the same thing. And the year after that. And I'd forgiven him every time because I trusted him, because he seemed so genuinely sorry, because I truly believed his work demanded these sacrifices from both of us. The private investigator also tracked down the truth about the accident, talked to the police officers who'd worked the scene, got access to reports I'd never seen because I'd been too grief-stricken to ask questions. There had been alcohol in Robert's system that night, not enough to be legally drunk, but enough to impair his judgment. His phone records showed he'd been texting Patricia right before the accident, arguing about something the investigator couldn't determine from the logs alone. And the location where he'd crashed wasn't on the route home from work like the police had told me. It was on the highway that led to Patricia's house. He hadn't been coming home to me that night at all. He'd been going to her, or maybe leaving her after a fight, and he'd died on that road between his two lives, never having to make the choice he'd been claiming he would make. Do you know what it's like to mourn someone twice? To grieve not just their death, but the death of who you thought they were, the death of your memories together, the death of your own naivete and trust? I mourned the Robert I'd thought I'd married, the honest, loyal, loving partner who'd been a fiction created by a talented liar. I mourned my own innocence, my ability to trust completely, my faith that good people existed and that I'd been smart enough to find one. I mourned the 7 years I'd spent in devoted widowhood, the thousands of dollars I'd donated in his name, the dates I'd turned down because I was still in love with a ghost who hadn't deserved my love when he was alive, let alone after he was dead. I canceled the recurring donation to future foundations, couldn't bear to send them another cent associated with Robert's name. And when they sent me a thank you letter for my years of support, I burned it. Watched it turn to ash while crying angry tears at the waste of it all. I went to Robert's grave for the last time on a cold morning in November, almost 8 years after his death, and I told him exactly what I thought of him, screamed it at his headstone while other mourners in the cemetery gave me wide berth, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. And maybe I was. Maybe I'd been having a breakdown since the moment I found those bank statements. Maybe I'd been falling apart for 8 years and just hadn't realized it, because I was too busy being the perfect grieving widow for a man who'd never been the perfect husband. I told Robert I hated him, that I wished I'd never met him, that I hoped wherever he was suffering the way he'd made me suffer, that his lies had poisoned every good memory we'd made together, that I would never forgive him for taking 7 years of my life even after he was already dead. And then I walked away from that grave and I never went back. Cut him out of my life the way he'd obviously been planning to cut me out of his before the accident took the choice away from him. The healing process has been slow and painful and nothing like the grief counseling book suggested because they don't write chapters on how to recover from discovering your dead husband was a cheating liar who played you for a fool. My therapist says I'm experiencing complicated grief, that the betrayal trauma is layered on top of the regular mourning process, that it's going to take time to work through all of it. Time. That's what everyone keeps telling me I need, as if enough time will eventually make this hurt less, make the betrayal sting less, make me trust again, love again, believe again. I'm not sure I believe them, but I'm trying. Going to therapy twice a week, joining a support group for people who've discovered infidelity after death, which turns out to be more common than you'd think. Apparently, a lot of dead people take their secrets to the grave and leave their spouses to discover the truth later. We sit in a circle in a church basement, these widows and widowers who thought they knew their partners, and we share our stories of secret bank accounts and hidden phones and affair partners who come to the funeral, and there's something oddly comforting in knowing I'm not alone in this particular hell. I've been working on rebuilding my life, figuring out who I am outside of being Robert's wife or Robert's widow, discovering interests and passions I'd let fall by the wayside during our marriage. I adopted a dog, a rescue named Murphy, who doesn't care about my past or my trust issues and loves me unconditionally in a way I'd thought only humans could. I took up painting, something I'd loved in college but abandoned when Robert said our apartment was too small for the mess, and now I have a little studio space in my second bedroom where I create terrible, wonderful art that no one sees but me. I've been learning to sit with uncertainty, to accept that I'll never know the full truth about Robert, that some questions will remain unanswered forever, that I have to make peace with ambiguity because the alternative is driving myself crazy looking for answers that don't exist. And slowly, painfully, I've been learning to forgive myself for not knowing, for trusting too much, for believing in someone who turned out to be unworthy of that belief. My therapist keeps reminding me that Robert's choices were his own, that I couldn't have known what I couldn't have known, that being trusting isn't a character flaw, it's actually a strength that someone took advantage of. I'm working on believing her, on being kinder to myself, on remembering that I loved honestly and openly even if Robert didn't, that my capacity for devotion and loyalty wasn't wasted even if it was misplaced, that I'm not stupid or naive or foolish for having faith in my marriage. I'm working on opening myself to the possibility of love again someday, though the thought still terrifies me, still makes my chest tight with anxiety about being fooled again, about missing signs again, about trusting someone who doesn't deserve it again. But I'm also trying to believe that not everyone is Robert, that there are people in the world who actually value honesty and loyalty, who actually mean their vows and keep their promises, who wouldn't dream of building elaborate lies and secret lives. I'm trying to believe that I deserve that kind of love, that I'm worthy of someone who will choose me fully and completely without reservation or deception. It's hard. Some days it feels impossible. But I'm trying because the alternative is giving Robert even more of my life than he already took, is letting his betrayal define me forever, is living in fear and bitterness instead of hope and possibility. So I keep going to therapy, keep talking to my support group, keep painting and walking Murphy, and slowly, carefully building a life that isn't centered around a lie or a ghost or a monthly ritual of devotion to someone who never deserved it. If you've ever been through something similar, if you've ever discovered that the person you thought you knew was actually a stranger, if you've ever had to reconcile the good memories with the terrible truth, please tell me about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories, your survival strategies, your moments of healing and hope. It's so important to understand that we're not alone in these experiences, that betrayal and loss and the complicated intersection of the two is something many people navigate, and that we can learn from each other's pain and resilience. If this story touched your heart, if it resonated with your own experiences or made you think about trust and love and the masks people wear, please leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps me share these stories with more people who might need to hear them, who might be sitting in their own closets discovering their own devastating secrets, who might need to know that survival is possible even when the pain feels unbearable. Please consider subscribing to Through My Eyes for more stories like this one, real experiences from real people navigating the complicated messiness of human relationships. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because every week I share another journey through heartbreak, betrayal, resilience, and ultimately hope. Remember that healing isn't linear, that it's okay to be angry and sad and confused all at once, that there's no right way to process the kind of betrayal that rewrites your entire history. Be gentle with yourself, seek support when you need it, and know that even in the darkest moments, there's a path forward, even if you can't see it yet. Thank you for listening to my story, for holding space for my pain, for being part of this community where we can be honest about the hardest parts of being human. I'll see you in the next video.